Hello and welcome to Stirling Senior Centre and Armchair Travel. Our guest speaker today is Jim French, who'll be taking us on a tour of Hog Hill, Stirling. Take it away, Jim.
Okay, good morning, everybody. This, I hope, will be interesting and fun. I understand that some members of the Christoph family are on, when I was hoping that would be the case. That will prevent me from maybe over embellishing or making any misstatements, and I would invite them to correct anything I say that may be a little off. But mostly what I want to do is give just an overview of what it was like for me as a kid, a Stirling kid growing up in West Stirling, to work for the wonderful Christoph family. And then I would go on later in life to be involved in working for the Department of Conservation and Recreation, previously known as the Metropolitan District Commission, and worked with the Christoph family in purchasing the better part of the farm for watershed protection purposes for the Wachusett Reservoir. So my connection to this property and this family goes back to when I was a teenager. So it was a great opportunity for me to have these experiences. The first picture that you see there isn't Hog Hill. That's the house I grew up in, which is about 1.5 miles north of the Christoph farm up 140. And it was from here that I would walk to work, not having a car or even a bicycle at the time. When I was 16 years old, I wanted a job like most teenage boys to earn some money. And my dad suggested I give George Christoph a call. And my dad and George had worked together on projects and served together on town committees. And before I even knew George Christoph, I knew of his generosity in that my dad had done some drawings for him when they were refurbishing their farmhouse on Route 140. And George, in his appreciation, had every year since sent a truckload of hay up to us to feed our donkey that we had for 25 years. So I knew George Christoph as a generous man, both through that gesture and all that my dad had to say about working with George. So I picked up the phone and I called, and George answered, and I said who I was and asked for a job. And he said, "Are you Arthur French's boy?" And I said I was. And he said, "All right, you're hired." Sight unseen, a leap of faith on his part. So I showed up for work that first day, went up the hill. And I'll add first that when the wind came from the south back in those days, which wasn't terribly often, but when it did, we could pick up the scent of the piggery up on the hill up where we lived. But I had never been really there up close. The day I started, I went up the hill and got a closer experience of what the aroma of thousands of pigs is. It was an interesting place. So I started off my experiences on Hog Hill making about $50 a week for a 6-day week. I think it was $1.30 an hour, and I can remember days when we kids who worked there, and if you were a kid in West Stirling, you were likely to get a summer job either with George and Joe Christoph or over with the other branch of the Christoph family, which was the peat farm over off of Muddy Pond Road across the street from the senior center. That was the.
Oh, okay.
So typically, boys in West Stirling got a job at one place or the other. So I was fortunate to work for George and Joe. And there were mornings when we would show up and be handed a hoe in the morning, and you went out into the fields and you hoed typically something like Blue Hubbard squash for 8 hours. That was, it was an experience in learning how to put in a day's work and get through it for for not much pay at the time, but when you're a kid and you get $50 a week, you're rich, right? So it was a good experience. And next slide, please. So in the long story of the Christoph farm, I know that George and Joe started back in 1940s, I guess. They grew up in that very pretty farmhouse at the intersection of Dana Hill Road and Route 140. It's now left the family, but I believe that was the original Christoph family homestead. And then over the years, George and Joe were prudent businessmen, and they purchased more and more property, and they assembled what would become the largest farm in Sterling, I believe, some 600 plus acres. That's a lot of land. And they did it on their own, and they established what would become probably the largest and most prosperous agricultural enterprise in the town. So I show this slide. It shows Merrill Road. For most of you who travel up and down Route 140, you'll recognize Merrill Road as that road that extends up through the Christoph hayfields, and up at the end, it dead ends at a gate at the moment. And if you were to go through the gate and up to the top of the hill, there was the piggery. This photo actually comes from 1994, when the Christoph family was, George Christoph passed away in, I believe, 1985. I think he was in his maybe 76th year. And Joe Christoph had a terrible accident and was in a nursing home at the time. So the founding fathers, if you will, of the Christoph farm, Happy Hollow Farms, were now gone. And in the mid 90s, the heirs, the Christoph family, were faced with some challenges, trying to keep the farm going amidst financial and family matters that would prove difficult, because it was a large asset worth a great deal of money, and with George and Joe gone, I know that they tried to reinvent the enterprise, and with mixed success. So this particular photograph is taken, I think, in 1994, when they were put in a position where they felt they needed to sell some real estate in order to cover expenses. And I think, fortunately, at the end of the day, these lots would be purchased by the Commonwealth for watershed protection purposes rather than become houses. And so to this day, when you drive down Route 140 and look up Merrill Road, you'll still see this very beautiful scenery. But it's at the top of the hill that where things were particularly interesting. Next slide, please. This is the top of the hill today. This picture was just taken a few days ago at the top of Merrill Road at the gate, where it ends as a town road and becomes part of the now DCR-owned property that was purchased from the Christoph family. You can today you can drive up that road, and you can park right where this photo was taken and hike in. And several of the photos that we're about to show you were taken just a few days ago. Sadly, I don't have many photographs. I don't have any photographs to speak of when the farm was in operation. I didn't carry a camera when I was a teenager, so we don't have those images. I'll bet the family has some, though, and I perhaps should have reached out to them to see what they might have to share. So, so this is where you would come up today and park and walk in and enjoy some of the scenery that you're going to see over the next few slides. Next one, please. This, as you can see in the image, is a photograph of a foundation. You can just make out the foundation. And these were long, I think they were 300 feet long, hog houses that were like maternity wards, and the hogs Pregnant hogs and hogs with broods would be in here. Believe there was a travel way down the middle of the building for trucks to come in the morning to shovel out manure and clean the pens, and in the afternoon the trucks would go in loaded with garbage to feed the pigs, and at times wool for bedding and water was also brought in via truck. They'd drive in one end of the building through a large doorway all the way out to the other end where another doorway, and you would exit the building. And so these were sort of the where the piglets were first born and raised, and a sow might have 8 or a dozen piglets, and if each sow had a bin that was maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet long or so, something like that, big enough for a sow and her brood, there would be at any given time probably a couple thousand piglets in the process of being raised. So at the time I worked there, it's my understanding there were approximately 5,000 pigs at any given time, all garbage fed, which was an interesting operation. So this is, if you go up Merrill Road and you park at that gate and you walk up a little further up the hill, and this is one of the first features that you'll see of these old foundations, the hog houses. All the infrastructure on this farm has since been raised by the Commonwealth, with the exception of the cooker, which we're going to see in a minute. There were at one time dozens of buildings up here. Again, the Christoph family, they were a very industrious bunch, and they had the hog houses and wool houses and the hog pens, and they had a sawmill and a maintenance building, and the cooker complex itself. It was quite an operation. The next slide, I believe, next one. Also, they had these beautiful fields at the top of the hill. If you turn around from where those hog houses were in that last photograph, you'll see, for instance, this particular hayfield. Again, the family took a lot of pride in their farm, and they had these large tracts, and they had, I don't know the exact number, but several hundred acres of hayland and corn land and land that was tilled for crops such as squash or corn or beans or what have you. So again, I would encourage anyone who's interested to go up there and take a walk, and you'll see some of the scenes like this one still today. The Commonwealth DCR leases out some of these fields to local farmers, which is why they remain open and viable. Next slide, please. This is the roadway leading into the cooker complex, again at the top of the hill. It's a curious thing for those of us who work there as kids to see just a lot of overgrowth and not all of the material and accoutrements and trucks and equipment that used to line these roads back when it was a going operation. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite scenes of the Christoph farm at the top of the hill. It's just before you get to the cooker. If you look southerly, you'll see this large expanse of very park-like, it's almost a savanna-like scene. And it seems to stay this way, even though it's not mowed, it's not maintained in any particular way. It's a curious field or pasture that, with these scattered trees, it just seems to stay this way year after year after year. And it's a very unusual kind of landscape for Sterling. And just before I took this photograph, I watched 2 deer bound off to the left. The Christoph farm now is a haven for all kinds of wildlife. Now that it's the hubbub of the human activity up there has ceased, it's become quite a wildlife habitat area. But again, this is one of my favorite scenes up there. It's well worth a hike in to take a look at some of these vistas on the farm. Next slide, please. Well, if you look down, in the vicinity of these hog yards and cookers is the soil has a mixture of the sort of the detritus of past decades. I mean, here we have a collection of bones, and I believe the next slide, if you'll go to the next one, you'll see remnants of piles of refuse and plastic that were the aftermath of the garbage that had been cooked in the cooker and fed to the pigs. But there was always this sort of material left behind, which was inedible. And as the years go by, these things are slowly disappearing under the undergrowth and brush. But still, if you walk around the piggery up there, you'll still see these remnants of features that represent a very, very busy past. Next slide, please. And here we have what remains of the cooker complex. This is a large concrete retaining wall, and atop it are two very large barrel-like steel structures that if I recall my stories, originally came from the Carling Brewery in Rhode Island. And this is an ingenious setup that George and Joe put together with, so trucks would drive up to the upper level with raw garbage. And there were routes. There was a garbage trucks that plied the towns of Sterling and Leominster and other towns, collecting garbage from households, which is always kind of a fun job for us kids to go to everyone's backyards and find the garbage traps and hope to see pretty girls sunbathing in the backyard once in a while. And we would bring these truckloads of garbage back, and they would be dumped into these large cooker drums, and then they would be cooked via steam really, from these large boilers that were in the maintenance building next door to it. And it was so much fun looking back for us kids to drive these rattly old trucks that Joe and Joe's son, Punky, we called him, George Jr., were geniuses at keeping these trucks alive and going, along with all of the other equipment that required that a farm like this to keep going. You would back the trucks against this concrete wall under those cookers. Next slide, please, make show a little better. Back the trucks along these walls underneath the cooker, and then hydraulic doors would you could climb up on a rampart of sorts, and you would manhandle the garbage through via a hydraulic lever that lifted the doors, and the cooked garbage would fall into the truck bed. It was always, and then the truck filled with steaming garbage you would drive it off to the various hog yards to feed the pigs. In the background of this photo, you can see that pine tree. Well, in front of the pine tree, you can see a concrete pad, and that's where that was sort of the heart of the operation, where Joe and Punky mostly did their magic. And the building has now been removed, but it might be the next slide. If you could go there. No, this is a close-up of those drums where the garbage was cooked, and these were the hydraulic doors that lifted and the garbage slid down into the truck. Next slide, please. This is what remains of where that maintenance building was. As a matter of fact, where all this graffiti is on that concrete pad were where the boilers were, which to my eye looked like locomotives without wheels at the time. They were huge. And that's what provided the steam for the cookers, which were just to the left. Next slide, please, I think shows. This is an older photograph of that building. There's that pine tree again. And again, this building has since been removed, but this was sort of, this was ground zero for the piggery. Next slide, please. I like this old photograph of an International K8 truck. This was one of the trucks that I drove when I was working there, and it was a thrill when looking back, I think this is a 1940s vintage International K8, and it doesn't look a whole lot different than it did when we drove them around the farm. Again, the clutch might be gone, and you might have to learn how to listen to the engine and the flywheel speed to shift just at the right moment so you could get into the next gear. The brakes might work if you pumped on them enough, but we hauled garbage and pig manure and what have you, corn silage with these old trucks. And again, the Christoph family mechanics kept them going, and it was quite an experience. Next slide, please. This is yet another shot of the cooker. Now, of course, all overgrown with bittersweet and vines, but at the time it was you would see clouds of steam rising above these cookers. It looked very industrial. And also, by the way, every day a truckload of garbage would come out of Boston. A whole trailer truckload would come out of Boston, show up every morning. So to feed 5,000 pigs was certainly a challenge. And so it required a lot of waste food. And it's interesting to note that Sterling today is in the process through our master planning effort, and others in town are looking to revive a compost facility in Sterling whereby food waste in town would be composted rather than put into the general waste stream and go to landfills. Apparently, approximately 25% of our waste is food waste. So Sterling is coming full circle and now looking to once again collect food waste, not like in days of old when we put them in a truck and brought them here and fed pigs, but rather to be composted. So the Christoph family actually did a real service for the Sterling and surrounding communities by recycling food waste and turning it into ham and bacon. Next slide, please. This is on top of the cooker, again, overgrown, so hard to get some good photographs, but you can see the sort of the pulley works, and it would be into these bins, into these drums that the garbage would be pushed by a loader. I remember Moke Cush was the foreman, and he would often be the one running this Huff loader, which would push the garbage in to be cooked. Next slide, please. I might show the interior. Here's a shot of the interior of those drums. Again, what you see, the circular backdrop is the hydraulic door that would lift. And you can see along either side, along the bottom, the pipes. And these were perforated, and that's where the steam would be forced into the garbage to essentially disinfect the garbage before it was fed to the pigs. I don't know how many, I imagine a couple of tons of garbage at a time would fit into these drums. It was a lot of food, well, next slide, please. This photograph is taken from the top of the cooker, looking out over a meadow. The concrete pad that you can see at the bottom is where that maintenance garage was. And if you look closely, you can see a stream running away off into the woodlands. And this is sort of demonstrative of why eventually the Metropolitan District Commission would be interested in acquiring the farm for water quality purposes, for it was not very conducive to have an operation of this scale on land that was only about a mile up from the Wachusett Reservoir, which is the water supply for approximately 2.5 million Massachusetts residents. 52 cities and towns, including Boston, Greater Boston, drinks the water from essentially that brook, ultimately, along with others. So that was the main motivation for eventually having this become state-owned property. Next slide, please. As I said, all of the buildings that were there, and there were many, these hog sheds were taken down. This one survived because it was down a overgrown lane and out of sight, and I think it was just missed. So there's still one left out there, and this would have been the front of the shed where the hogs would go in. You could still see remnants of the wool bedding inside there. They were kept quite comfortable and out of the weather, and winters were cold up on the hill, but the hogs were afforded nice, comfortable wool bedding to settle into to stay warm. The next slide, please, I think shows, well, I turned around and took a picture of interesting birch stand. Another interesting facet of the Christoph farm, the 600 acres, a lot of it is woodland. And there's been some cutting and logging over the years, and the woodland areas that are on the Christoph farm now are also well worth taking a hike up into the farm and walking around in the woods and seeing the beautiful stands, in this case of birch and others of oaks and pines. And it's just a very, very beautiful piece of ground. Next slide, please. This is the back of that one last remaining hog shed. Again, it shows a typical configuration of what there were once maybe a dozen or more of these housing the hogs. Once they left those long sheds where they were piglets with their sow mothers, they would be put into these pens to be allowed to grow. And I believe they went to market at about age 9 months. Next slide, please. There was, in the course of the state purchasing the farm, there was an issue with a landfill, which was used primarily to get rid of the refuse that came from separating the manure that came out of those hog yards from the inorganic material that came with it, like plastic bags, bottles, cans, and that sort of thing. So as you can well imagine, when you bring in tons and tons of garbage on a daily basis and feed them to thousands of hogs, there's going to be some waste management issues. So this large sort of hill slope off to the left is in an area of about 14 acres that the Christoph family still owns, that was taken out of the purchase of the farm because of waste considerations that actually gave it it hurt the value of the farm to include it in the overall acquisition. So the decision was made that the family would hang on to this particular piece, which is useful to them for other purposes. But it was an interesting process separating the manure from the trash. So there was again, the Christoph ingenuity comes into play when there was a facility called the separator, where manure from the hog pens, after they were finished eating all of the food, and then there was this waste left over, along with their manure, would be put into this mechanism that was a conveyor of rods that was powered by a tractor power takeoff, and it would roll like a conveyor, and the manure would fall into a pit, and the trash would extend further into another pile and be taken out to this landfill, and the manure would be spread on the fields for fertilization. So it was a pretty interesting process. Next slide, please. This is another shot of some of the woodlands that you'll find on the Christoph farm. Very, very bucolic and pretty, and I have a forestry background, so I have a soft spot for woodland scenery, and you'll find this next slide is a spring, which is up on, again, in the farm, showing the moss and a spring popping out of the ground, and a tree that actually is housing a porcupine at the time I took the photograph. Again, if you're into walking woodlands, the Christoph farm is a wonderful place to go. Next slide, please. The Christophs built beautiful roads. These two photographs, I'm standing in the same spot. I took a picture in one direction, turned around and took a picture in another. Again, if you're looking for a wonderful hiking experience, come on up to Hog Hill and you're going to find roads like this. This one was built to connect the main piggery to what was called Grandma's Place, which was their original operation down closer to Route 140, north of the main piggery site. And this goes through the Christoph forest to connect the two piggeries one to the other. They're beautiful, beautiful roads, well built, and they've withstood the test of time. And the state now maintains them by mowing them on an annual basis. So again, skiing or hiking, it's a great opportunity. Thanks to the Christophs. Next slide, please. Another fascinating project. George Christoph George and Joe, I suppose, and I suppose his sons, back in the early 60s, took a large red maple wetland, swamp area up, this actually straddles the Holden Sterling line, and they converted it to agricultural land. And they did so by bulldozing ditches through and around this area. It was referred to as the 40-acre field, although I think it's, if I check my map, it's closer to 30 acres, but it's a large area. And at the time I worked there, this was used to grow blue Hubbard squash by the truckload. And I can remember days spent up there hoeing blue Hubbard squash all day long, or days when we would be given a gunny sack with lime in it to go around and sprinkle through the hemp of a grain bag lime on each of the thousands of blue Hubbard plants so that the woodchucks wouldn't eat them. And I can remember earlier in the spring going through and still picking out mostly roots and chunks of wood and stones that were left over from the clearing operation. This was back a few years before the Wetlands Protection Act, when these kinds of activities farmers could do without running into any regulatory issues with the Department of Environmental Protection. So, there's a couple more slides that show some of the ditch work that they did. It was an amazing project, and it created a very large, very fertile field. And incidentally, the blue Hubbard squash was then harvested and trucked off to the Table Talk Pie Company. And here's the big secret: Table Talk pie, pumpkin pie, is actually blue Hubbard squash with some pumpkin seasoning. So that was a big crop for the Christoph family, to tons and tons, shed-fulls of blue Hubbard squash. And another interesting story is that while we were out there midsummer in the broiling heat, hoeing blue Hubbard squash, because the manure that was spread on there to help fertilize it would have, among other things, apparently seeds from watermelons. And when we were hoeing, we would let the watermelon plants grow. We would show a deference to watermelon. And the time came to do the harvesting. Interspersed amongst the blue Hubbard squash would be these watermelon plants. And we would just, in the course of doing the hard work of harvesting, we would chop open these errant watermelons and savor the juices. And we were rather wasteful. We would just cut the heart out of the watermelon and eat it and throw the rest down. There was so many of them. So that was an interesting byproduct of all that hard work in the blue Hubbard operation on the so-called 40-acre field. The next slide might show, and then this is the ditches around the field were prone to grow a lot of algae. This is a water-filled ditch with the green algal growth on top. And this speaks to the fact that there are still a great many nutrients available to these waterways around the field. So we get this kind of growth, which is, it brings in ducks. When I took this photograph, 2 mallards took off from that patch of open water right in front of me. Also, when I was up there the other day taking these photographs, there was a herd of 5 deer in the 40-acre field, and I flushed a ruffed grouse, and also came across some bear sign. So again, what was once a thriving agricultural operation is now a thriving wildlife wildlife management area, if you will, or refuge. Next slide, please. This was the entryway, one of the entryways culverting across the ditch into the 40-acre field, which is now slowly growing in to what's called early succession growth. And again, this is absolutely prime habitat for all manner of wildlife. So the pendulum swings and the blue Hubbard squash are gone, but the natural world is taking over and taking full advantage of this beautiful area up on the Sterling Holden line. Next slide, please. Here's another view of one of the ditches on the edge of the field to the right, ditch to the left. I mean, the Christoph should have been hired to create the Erie Canal, in my opinion. This is just this is exquisite bulldozer work, I guess. I mean, these broad ditches, which again, eventually wend their way down to the Wachusett Reservoir via the Quinnapoxet River. So another reason why the state would come to acquire this farm from the Christoph family was for water supply protection purposes. We would not want to show the people in Boston, greater Boston, some of these photos of the algae covered ditches and tell them it's their drinking water supply necessarily. But now once it travels out of this area and through the woods, it becomes crystal clear, potable water. And so we have few worries. Next slide, please. Oh, I took this because, again, I mentioned that there was some bear sign, and here was a dead snag on the edge of the field that had been clawed at by a bear, presumably looking for ants or ant larvae. So again, wildlife, it's as a wildlife refuge, the Christoph Farm is now unexcelled. Next slide, please. And at the end of the ditch, actually on the neighboring property that belongs to the Miola family, the ditch terminates really into a broad, beautiful pond. It is my understanding George did this just as a friendly gesture to his neighbor and gave them the boundary line between the Christoph farm and the Miola property is about where I'm standing to take the photo. It's a pretty little pond. And again, the ducks were taking advantage of it. Next slide, please. So this is an older photograph taken some years ago of the hog shed, birthing shed as they were called. This has since been removed, but it shows you the typical configuration of the open doorway, the truck lane that goes down the middle of the building with hog bins left and right. And these were the older houses over what was referred to as Grandma's place. And that long grass road that you saw in previous slides connects this to the piggery up at the top of Hog Hill. This is over more towards where Dana Road meets Route 140 near the original farmhouse. Next slide, please. Is there another one? Maybe that's the last one. Yeah. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about, well, you know what, let's open it up to questions right now. If anyone has any questions at this point, I'd be happy to try to answer them. And if the Christophs, if any members of the family are on and they have a better answer or can add to it, I would invite them to do so.
No, I want to hear it.
Well, you can hear it. You can talk too.
I hear somebody.
Go ahead.
My brother-in-law, Fred Cush, operated in that operation for many years.
Yep.
And did a lot of that equipment.
Fred Cush. I remember Fred Cush.
He just passed this last year.
Yes. You know, I got to know Fred Cush a little better this past couple of years ago when oddly enough, the DCR purchased his house and property on the Stillwater River off of Route 140 because they were moving down to, I think it was North Carolina, was it?
Yes. Bob Nealand here.
Oh, hi, Bob. Yeah, so I'm sorry to hear that Fred passed away.
And Betty about 4 months before him.
Oh, they're both gone now?
Yeah.
Fred was a major presence on that farm when I was a kid, and his brother Moke, who was the foreman, the two of them were good guys to work with.
100 years ago, they'd have been the city blacksmith.
You're right about that. Very clever guys.
I did get a few tours up there and when it was in operation. I wonder if the Christoph family would have any older pictures, but
I wonder that too.
reason for coming on, another reason for coming on is every fall, the fire department would have a barbecue downtown. And the Christophs would put aside a field, and they, as well as some of our people, would pick all the corn, they'd give it to the barbecue.
I remember.
The whole town ate that.
I remember helping to pick that corn.
Yep.
They grew a lot of corn. It was interesting to, again, as a kid, to show up at the farm in the morning, and George would say, we're gonna pick corn, because he had markets, local supermarkets that would buy crates of corn. There was 144 ears to a crate, a gross.
Did you count them?
Yeah, well, we counted them when we created them.
My gosh.
We would they had a tractor with an old Model A pickup bed welded to the back of it, and the tractor would go down through the rows, and each of us kids would be in a row picking the corn and throwing it into the back of this tractor. And we'd have so much corn piled on it that it was an international tri-wheel with the two small front wheels tractor. There's so much corn in the back of that tractor that the front wheels would be dancing off the ground, and so he would have to steer it like in a wheelchair by using his rear wheel brakes. And then we would bring it out to the yard and crate it up, and that was a good experience.
One
And
more story.
I always enjoyed when George said I could go with him to deliver the corn, because it meant you could sit in the truck for a while and not have to work.
Another story was in the 70s, they had one of the pens had a fire, and we went up there and sloshed through and put it out. Got a little messy and all that, but by the time all the trucks were back to the station, there was cases of Coca-Cola and other libation ready for us, delivered from the Christophs.
That's how they were. They really were a very generous family. I can remember the apple fiesta too. Do you remember that? It was over in back of Green Meadow Lodge. It was every year there was an event, an apple fiesta thing over there in that field. And again, Christoph generosity. So
Actually, I just had a message from Greg, that he has a myriad of photographs on his Facebook page that are accessible and he would love to share.
Oh, that's terrific. Good. I look forward to seeing those. Yeah. So I would work there for 4.5, 5 years, summers and weekends and vacations, and then I was there from 1969 to 1974, I think. And then in 1974, I was in college and getting a degree in forestry. So I went and got a job at Curtis Lumber Company in a sawmill so I could get some different experience. And it's kind of sad to leave the Christoph farm behind in my arc of my life, but it would return when I would eventually become a forester around the Wachusett Reservoir for the MDC. And then I would become the land acquisition director for the MDC, which would become the DCR. And it all circled back. I would come back and work with the Christoph family to acquire property for watershed protection purposes. And we started in 1990. We bought, they had laid out 13 lots, I think, on Dana Hill Road and John D. Road. And it was down near the river, down near the Stillwater River. So long story short, we ended up purchasing the 13 lots. So you'll still see fields over there being mowed by local farmers to this day. And that was about $500,000, which was helpful to the family to take care of some farm debt and inheritance taxes and fees that I know the family was struggling with after George's death. So that was our first interaction, for mine anyway, with the Christoph family coming back as a land acquisition person for MDC. And then in 1994, that first slide we saw at the beginning with a for sale sign on the tree, that was another 7 or 8 lots, I think, that were laid out along Merrill Road and Route 140. Again, they were compelled to raise funds to handle some, take care of some financial obligations that were burdensome. So the DCR purchased those lots as well. So those fields are still there to look at as you drive by Route 140. And then in the mid 1990s, various efforts were made by investors. There was a fellow by the name of, I forget his name, but he was going to put in a horse track. And if some of you older folks in town will remember the controversy of the Christoph farm becoming another Suffolk Down sort of place. As a matter of fact, the owner of Suffolk Down was the person who put a bid in on the farm to purchase it for a racetrack. And I remember the capacity was to be up to 12,000 visitors a day. So the impact was going to be substantial. And the interest in the farm was in large part driven by the fact that this 600-acre farm was at the interchange of the newly constructed, relatively new Interstate I-190 and Route 140. You get an interstate ramp, and the land that's at the end of it is increased in value, as you might imagine. So that was a controversial effort. The racetrack proposal fell by the wayside for a variety of reasons. And then there was another investor who came forward who was looking to put in an 18-hole golf course and residential housing on the farm. And we were shown some plans of that proposal. And as a matter of fact, the clubhouse for the golf course was right where the cooker was. That'd be quite a change of scenery, wouldn't it? And then for a variety of reasons, that proposal fell through. So we circled back DCR and solicited the family's interest in taking a look at a portion of the farm, which was a couple hundred acres of the 600, sort of the rear portion where you saw that 40-acre field, and where the piggery, just sort of beyond, west of the piggery itself, mostly woodlands and wetlands. And we surveyed out 200 some odd acres to purchase separately from the farm. And again, there was some discord within not just family membership, but each family member had a separate legal counsel. And it seemed to me that the family was willing to get along more than the various attorneys who were involved. And it's been my experience over the years that, I hope there's no attorneys in the audience, but they like to fan the flames. So it was, perhaps with good reason, it was questioned as to whether it was prudent for the Christoph family to sell a portion of the farm to the state for watershed, and how that might affect the value of the whole thing. So the DCR came in and we offered to do a comprehensive study of the entire 600 acres, and we hired a consulting firm who came in and actually laid out an 18-hole golf course and residential housing. And it was finally agreed by most parties involved that this represented what we refer to as the highest and best use of the property, which would bring the most value on the market. And so we did an appraisal, and based on that, and long story short, we ended up coming to an agreement with the Christoph family to purchase the entire farm, almost the entire farm. The acreage that's off of Dana Hill Road, which now has Sterling Nursing Home and a self-storage place across the street on behind George Christoph's house. They kept that part and sold it separately to those entities. But everything west of Route 140, which was 580 some odd acres, we came to an agreement, and the state purchased the farm for $6.5 million. And discouraging for the Christoph family was that approximately 750,000 of that had to go into cleanup costs and remediation stuff, which would have had to have been done no matter who bought the place sooner or later. So the family ended up with something north of $5 million, which allowed them to pay off their obligations and have some left over. So I went from being a 16-year-old shoveling pig manure and hoeing squash to being the guy that did his best to negotiate a deal and hand them a pretty sizable check at the end of the day. So the arc of my career from my very first job to the one I retired from, which was land acquisition with TCR, played a big role in the Christoph family farm. Can I answer any questions?
I have a question. You mentioned was it Miola? There's a monument up just in the woods beyond that little pond that you showed.
There is, to their dad.
Tribute to the father.
That's right.
Who is that? You said there's a different family though that belongs to?
Well, it's the Miola family that's primarily from West Boylston.
Okay.
The Miola ice cream, Miola dairy,
Yep.
same
Yep.
family, as different members of the family. And that was their little Shangri-La. In order to get to that spot, they'd drive up through the Christoph farm, up through the piggery. And again, they were friends with George, and George welcomed their presence up in there. And they built a little camp up there, and they had some buildings, and that's where the family sort of retreated. And they had a wonderful little spot, which has now fallen into disrepair, but the stone that commemorates their dad's memory is still there. And the town bound, which is the corner of West Boylston, Sterling, and Holden, all come together right on that Miola tract.
The bear sighting or the remnants that you saw, he comes and visits my yard quite often. I have quite a lot of pictures of him coming through.
Do you have bird feeders?
I do. I have taken them in now because he's shown up again, but we do feed the birds through the winter.
You know, for a while after the pig operation shut down, there were some feral pigs living in the woods for a few years up off of Holden Road, causing some trouble with the neighbors for a while. Pigs are very intelligent, resilient animals, and a few escaped this situation and lived in the woods on their own for, I have to think, maybe 4 or 5 years after the piggery was closed. It was remarkable.
Yeah, we've heard a story of one coming, wandering through the development here up Birch Drive area.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. Anyone else have any experiences to share or questions to ask? Well, that's the brief overview of the history of Hog Hill.
Jim, I
Yes.
have a question for you. You mentioned that the bedding for the hogs, it was wool. Is that sheep's wool or their hog hairs, or where did the wool come from?
It was waste wool from a wool company in Worcester. I remember going in and helping with this task of bringing back truckloads of waste wool. I don't know why the wool was considered waste, but it was, I believe, sheep's wool. It was some kind of a felting company in Worcester, and this was all their discarded wool that for some reason they didn't use in their process. So George would purchase this wool, and there was a big shed on the property near the cooker, which was filled with tons of wool, and that's what kept them warm.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, the other aspect that the farm entailed or included was a dairy herd. I mean, they were quite a bunch, the Christoph family. They were hardest working people around.
Sounds like Eric.
It is.
Hi, Eric. You're right. I'm glad you brought that up. They also had I think they, at the time I was there, I think they were milking 46 head of Holsteins. So it was a pretty big dairy operation along with the piggery. I'm glad you brought that up. And that was a whole nother aspect of the Christoph enterprise. So hence there was a lot of acreage devoted to growing field corn for them. And we used to get a chuckle when city folk, we called them, would drive by, say over Dana Hill Road, and they'd see this corn as tall as an elephant's eye and these huge ears of corn. And we could see where people stopped and picked it off and took off thinking they got a free armload of corn. And I'm sure when they cooked it, went to eat it, they found out that field corn is very different than sweet corn. So they got their due. So haying and corn production was a big part of the operation.
And the other part of their self-sufficiency was having the sawmill, and they would cut their own lumber to build all these buildings and repair them. And it's quite a thing.
Sure was. Was it an old Lane mill? I think it was.
Yes. Yeah.
But yep, they put up their own mill because they used so much lumber on the farm that they decided to create their own supply. That was part of the, people used to be pretty ingenious. Maybe they still are, but in my experience, the Christophs were among the best. They really made things happen. It was a very, very bustling operation, and I think there were probably always at least a couple dozen employees. Some of them were pretty interesting characters, I'll say. Lifers, we called them. We kids who worked there as teenagers were reminded that maybe it's a good idea to go learn a trade or go to college and maybe not spend our life here doing this. But there were those.
Did the Christophs have a veterinary service that would come in to treat their animals, or?
Yes, they did. And I can remember, I don't remember his name, but I remember a veterinarian coming every so often in a big black car. I think it was a Cadillac. He'd open the trunk and our job as kids is an interesting story. So in those hog sheds, like the one you see in the photograph, we would have to go in there and capture the piglets that would be inoculated and castrated, which was not fun for us teenage boys to experience. But and it's difficult enough to catch piglets, but when the other piglets are in the hog shed are screaming and being very agitated, it was a challenge. I know that sometimes at country fairs they have pig catching events, and I think I would have been pretty good at that at the time. So we would catch these young piglets. I don't know, maybe they were a month old, and we would have to hang them by their rear legs over the edge of the pen that they were being raised in. And there would be two long needles that this vet would plunge into their gut. One was for hog cholera, and the other one was something else I don't remember. And then if they were males, they would be castrated. Moke with his penknife would do that in a flash. And then they would cut a notch out of their ear, and we put them back down, and the notch in the ear told everybody that they'd been so treated. Okay, I'll say it. So at the end of that, a day of doing that, the main floor in the hog house would have hundreds of basically testicles on the floor, and we 16-year-old, 17, 18-year-old boys would just, it was hard to get used to. We were really glad we weren't pigs. So yes, there was a veterinarian, and that's what he did. And I'm sure there were other things that the veterinarian came to do, particularly with the dairy operation, but there was veterinary attendance on the farm.
How did you move them from the birthing shed to their permanent sheds? Were they herded out, or were they trucked?
They herd pretty well. If you get a couple of guys with a couple of canes, and you can herd pigs pretty easily. So you could just drive them down the road into the next pen. It's my memory. I don't remember having to chase after them too much. There was also, every year one pig would be, at least one anyway, would be slaughtered on site. You know, all the pigs would be, I think it was every Monday morning, a truckload of pigs would go off to the slaughterhouse in Clinton. And I didn't enjoy loading those poor fellas onto a truck off to their demise, but I was a soft-hearted kid. But even worse was when there would be a pig would be slaughtered for George's own or Joe's own freezer. So that was done basically at that site where the cooker was, and I did not enjoy that process at all. I'm just too soft-hearted. It's not a pretty picture. But that's the way it is, you know, if you're going to live in the country, in a rural community, and if you're going to eat bacon, which I like bacon, that's how you got to raise pigs to do it.
Did they also raise chickens?
No, I don't ever remember chickens. There was dairy, there was hogs, there was an apple orchard, there was truck farming with hay and corn and squash, and I remember picking beans. I didn't like picking beans. Beans left me with a sore thumbs at the end of the day, and I'd crawl on my belly trying to pick beans. And haying was fun for the most part. You know, we would be out there trying to beat the storm clouds, and again in those days, you know, everybody back then baled hay in the standard bales, you know, 40-pound bales that we think of. You know, today a lot of farmers have gone to the big round bales. I don't know, Eric, you still do square bales, and a few other people, but we always did it back then. And we had to follow the truck and pick up the bales behind the baler and throw them into the back of the truck and off to the barn. I remember one time I was up in the mow of the barn, which, by the way, blew down, was destroyed on July 10th, 1989, when a tornado came over Hog Hill and destroyed the barn. Went through the cemetery and tipped stones, but it didn't tip George's. And I was up there. There's a conveyor belt that sends bales up, and then there'd be 2 or 3 of us up there stacking the hay in the loft in the mow. And they were coming at us fast and furious. And I can remember a bale of hay hitting me on the head, and I actually blacked out. And when I came to, there were bales of hay piling on top of me. And then another one of the kids hollered down, "Stop, stop, stop. Frenchie's been knocked out. But he seems okay now," says George is down at the bottom of the conveyor. "He seems okay now, but he was knocked out." "Well, is he okay? Is he awake?" "Yeah, he's awake." "Okay, let's go." And he plugged it back in again. "Is he awake? Okay, let's get back to work." One of my more memorable experiences in the hay barn.
Jim, another story I remember you telling, and you don't have to name the person, but it's just relates to the old characters that used to be around. It was a particular day that you were in the truck with him, and it was lunchtime, and I don't know, you may remember what I'm talking about.
You're talking about Wacky Jim.
About his false teeth or something.
Wacky Jim was, we just called him Jim to his face, but everywhere he was Wacky Jim. And he was an interesting character. All he did was shovel pig manure in the morning and out of the bins. He didn't drive. Someone else had to drive the truck. He was mentally challenged and lived with his sister in West Boylston and walked 3 or 4 miles every day to work with a lunch pail. And I don't know what his diagnosis was, but he was, if you irritated him enough, he could be dangerous. So you tried not to. But his sole job was shoveling manure out of the bins in the morning and shoveling garbage back in the afternoon. And he, to my knowledge, he never did anything else. And you kind of walked on eggshells around Jim because he was easily agitated. And I can remember one day he hated rats, and you know, there were rats because it's all that garbage. And I was in, I believe, that very building that we see in the photograph there. I was helping him. I was the driver and the fellow forker of manure. And he saw a rat crawling up the wall on the opposite side. He was on the right side that you see in that photograph in a bin shoveling manure into the truck. And I was in one next to him. And across the building on the left-hand side, a rat was crawling up the wall from one of the bins. And he took his shit fork, as we called it, pardon my French, and it's like he was in the Olympics, like a javelin. He launched that fork across the truck aisle, across the bins, and impaled that rat against the wall.
Whoa.
That's a memorable experience. But what Eric's referring to is he also had a habit of, he would sit in the truck that we use for hauling manure and garbage, which had no doors and it was covered in flies and manure and garbage. And it was a disgusting truck, just disgusting. But that's how it was. But he would open his lunch pail at noontime. He'd sit in the truck to have his lunch. Now, Jim had a complete set of false teeth. So to eat his lunch, and they were loose fitting. When he talked, they actually chattered a little bit, his teeth inside his mouth. And he would take his teeth out and set them on the dashboard of the truck while he gummed down his lunch, which was interesting to watch. And while he's having his lunch, the flies, which are ubiquitous, they're everywhere, were landing on his teeth and the dashboard and anything. But when he was done with his lunch, he would brush the flies off his teeth and put them back in his mouth.
It's always good for a laugh.
As I say, there were some real characters on that farm. It was quite an experience. I could go on and on and on with stories, but I won't. Sorry?
How many people were employed at the time?
I'm thinking a couple dozen at any given time. There was always a clutch of us teenagers. When I was there, it was myself and Joel Cluthier and Richard Ronsky and Richard Turcott. We were all teenagers. We were referred to as the Peanuts, the Peanut Crew. I don't know why. We got all the worst jobs, but that's how it is. And then there were the lifers, we call them, the guys who were there, that was their living. And there was the fellow who drove the trailer truck to Boston every day. And then there was the fellow who would be the herdsman who handled the dairy. And then there was a bunch of us up on Hog Hill. And the Christoph family themselves was George and Joe. And then they had George Jr., which we called Punky, and Kevin and Jerry. And they were all part of the operation as well. It was a true family affair. Can I answer any other questions, or does anyone have any remembrances of their own from?
I remember a story long ago of when old Christoph was mowing or haying down by 140, that when it came lunchtime or when he got tired, he'd just crawl under the tractor for shade and take a nap.
He would. It sounds like.
I always report him as falling off the tractor or dead or something.
He would. George was prone to take naps, sort of at the spur of the moment. Yeah, he would. This sounds like Ken. Is that you, Ken?
Yeah.
Yeah, he would do that. And George, George died with his boots on. He just was having breakfast at the table, getting ready to go out. He had his boots on and everything. It's my understanding. And he just went to his reward right there. So, but I remember going into the house and he would at midday he would typically take a nap, and what he would use for a pillow was the brick hearth of the wood stove that was in the kitchen, which didn't look very comfortable to me, but that's what he did. He'd lay down on the floor and take a nap, and then he'd get up and go back at it.
It is.
Bob Mosier Bob Nealon here. Bob Mosier would go up and mow fields for them, and come lunchtime or hot time of the day, Mrs. Christoph would be out there with a basket or a jug of water, trying to track him down and feed him, give them a drink.
Yeah. Yeah,
Just the way they treated their people.
May Christoph, when we were doing haying and if it got to be later in the afternoon and we would get overtime, our $1.30 became, $2.45 an hour. It was great. But we'd be haying well into the evening. And so we'd miss supper. So May would come out with a tray of sandwiches, usually bread and butter sandwiches and bottles of Coca-Cola so that we could keep on keeping on. I also, an interesting story, May drove around at that time in a 1950 something Ford Woody station wagon, the kind of thing that today is probably worth $100,000, those old wood-sided Fords, but it was in pretty tough shape. But the Christoph boys, being the mechanics they were, kept it going. And I can remember one time she came up the hill and she was somewhat irritated, and she said to George, I don't mind driving an old car, but when I can see the stripes on the road underneath my feet because the floors have rotted away, she says, maybe it's time I got a new used car. And George shook his head, and after she went back down the hill, he turned to us kids and he says, something in life you want to remember: always be loyal to your wife, to your dog, and to your car. You only need one of each. But I think he finally did get her another car where the floorboards were still intact. They were frugal people.
Yeah, everybody was, yeah. I don't know. Goodbye. Thank you so much. This was very interesting.
I hope you enjoyed it, and I encourage anyone who hasn't been up there to go up and explore Hog Hill as it looks today.
Thank you for your knowledge and memories. You brought a lot to us.
You're very welcome.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you, Jim. On behalf of everyone here and Sterling Senior Centre,